Good morning, everyone. My name is Sue. On behalf of the Goochland branch of the Pamunkey Regional Library, welcome to today's program, Planning and Installing a Rain Garden, which is part of the 2022 Horticultural Series developed in a partnership between the library and the Goochland Powhatan Master Gardener Association. Representing the Master Gardeners today, we have Audrey Hirsch, who is a Goochland Powhatan Master Gardener Association volunteer, and today's presenter, Linda Toler. Linda has gardened in a variety of regions, from the fertile farmlands of central Ohio to the rocky glacial soils of upstate New York to the mucky clays in the hot, humid mid-Atlantic Piedmont. Currently, she and her husband garden in western Goochland County, growing vegetables, fruits and berries, herbs, shrubs and perennials, and anything else that catches her fancy. She has been an extension master gardener for over 10 years and is currently the project leader for the Dirty Hands Project, which maintains 2 demonstration gardens on the Goochland campus of the Reynolds Community College. One of those gardens is a rain garden, which Linda will encourage you to check out when you're in the vicinity. All right, let's get started. The chat feature is available, so please send us your questions. They'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. Here is Linda Toler with Planning and Installing a Rain Garden.
Thank you, Sue. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about residential rain gardens. As Sue mentioned, we do have a rain garden at the Reynolds campus here in Goochland. This is a picture of the rain garden from a few years ago. You're welcome to visit the campus gardens any day from dawn till dusk. So if you're in the area and you want to check out the rain garden and the other gardens, please feel free to do so. Today, we're going to explore why rain gardens are important, what a rain garden is, and also what it isn't, and how a rain garden actually works. We'll then turn our attention to the things you need to consider when you're planning a rain garden, and then we'll walk through the construction process step by step for installing the garden. Then we'll wrap up with a few garden planting inspirations to help you get started, and we'll also talk just a bit about maintenance for a rain garden. Rain gardens are often misunderstood, so let's take a look at what they are, why they're important, and how they work. During a rain event or even a heavy snow melt, water will run off of all of the impervious surfaces in our landscape, things like roofs and paved areas and driveways and even compacted soil. And to a lesser extent, it will also run off of permeable surfaces like our yards and gardens. And this runoff will take with it anything that's laying on those surfaces, including harmful materials such as the chemicals that we use on our yards, unused fertilizers and herbicides, pesticides, petroleum products such as motor oil and gasoline that leak from our vehicles, bacterial contaminations from animal waste, and even eroded soil that washes from the bare, unplanted areas in our landscape. And this runoff and all of the contaminants that it's carrying with it washes into our ditches and our storm drains and into our streams and eventually makes its way to our rivers and in our area into the Chesapeake Bay, where it can cause significant damage. It can harm wildlife, it can contaminate recreation areas, and it can also introduce toxins into our drinking water sources. And the sediments suspended in the water can not only damage aquatic life, but it can be expensive to remove once it builds up. So rain gardens are designed to help mitigate these problems by removing those contaminants before they make their way to our waterways. So unlike most gardens, which are generally level at soil level or raised a bit, a rain garden is a landscaped, shallow, flat bottom depression, and it collects runoff after a rain event. The water actually pools in the depression and slowly seeps out of that depression into the underlying soil, removing contaminants as it drains. Well, I should have clicked these as I went along. So a rain garden is not a shallow depression of stagnant water, nor is it a bog. It's not a pond. And if properly constructed, it will not be a mosquito breeding ground. Now, a rain garden has 6 main components. On this first slide, we're showing 3 of the components that are actually structural. There has to be a way for the runoff to flow into that shallow depression. Then you have that shallow depression, which is referred to as the ponding area, and that's where the water will collect after a rain event. And then if your garden is built on a slope, you will need a berm on the downhill side to keep water from running right out of the garden when it rains. And so that is the 3rd structural component you'll have to consider for your rain garden. The other 3 components, which I've highlighted in green here, are actually actively involved in remediating the pollutants in the runoff. In the soil layer, certain pollutants are adsorbed onto the soil particles, and that keeps them from leaching into the groundwater. The plants aren't just there to be pretty. They actually take up excess nutrients and also help the garden dry out. The mulch layer, which is right on top of the shallow depression, again, isn't there just for aesthetics. It's also the site, excuse me, of microbial action, which can break down, excuse me, some of the organic pollutants. Mulch also helps keep the soil surface slightly moist so that when water enters the garden, it readily starts filtering down through the underlying soil. If you've ever tried to water a very dry garden bed, for example, you know that it takes a while to get that top surface wetted so that the water can actually start penetrating down into the garden. So this is what a rain garden would look like after a rainstorm. Not only does it filter out pollutants, but it will also trap sediments that are in the runoff. And because the garden is about 30% more permeable than just regular soil, it helps to recharge the groundwater as well. And as with most gardens, it's going to help beautify your landscape and provide a habitat for wildlife and insects. So as with most gardens, it's really important to plan your rain garden before you start digging. Because of the special function of the rain garden, it's important that the garden be sited and sized correctly. Otherwise, it's not going to really do its job. And as always, be sure that you have proper permission from your homeowner association or your local county before you start digging. Now, I suspect if you go to your homeowners association and ask them for permission to put in a rain garden, they're not going to know what you're talking about. So that might be a case where you ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And as far as I know, Goochland County doesn't have any restrictions on installing a rain garden, in a residential rain garden. Now, when choosing a location for your rain garden in your landscape, you want to, first of all, position it so that it collects the most runoff possible. But at the same time, you want to position it to avoid damaging your existing landscape or other structures in your property or your neighbor's property. And also you want to site it so it's aesthetically pleasing, because it's going to be a garden just like any other garden in your landscape. Now, specifically, when selecting a site, you want to put it as close to the runoff source as possible. If we look at this house right here, if you're trying to collect the water that's coming from this downspout over here on the right, you don't want to have your rain garden over here, as in the picture. You want it closer to that particular downspout. It looks like this garden is designed to collect the water coming from this downspout on the left. This is a no-brainer. It needs to be in the path of the runoff. If you're collecting water from, let's say, a patio, and you place your garden on the uphill side of the patio, that's not going to collect the water. So it has to be in the runoff path. The other thing you have to be careful of is you want to place your garden more than 10 feet away from your house. And the reason for this is you don't want the water that's filtering down through the rain garden to seep into your foundation and mess it up. So make sure that you keep it a little bit away from your house. And the last and one of the more important things for the function of the rain garden is that you want to place it in an area that has good soil drainage. Now, how do you know if the area you have selected has good soil drainage? Well, here's a little test that you can do. You want to dig a hole that's about 12 inches deep and 6 inches in diameter. And a post hole digger, if you have one, is great for digging that hole, or just a narrow spading shovel will work just fine. You want to fill the hole to the top with water and let that water drain out. You want to then refill that empty hole with water and measure the depth of the water in the hole. Then you want to check the depth every hour for about 4 hours. And from that information, you can calculate the inches of water per hour that drained out of that hole. And that'll give you the drainage rate. So for example, if in 4 hours, 4 inches of water drained out of the hole, then your drainage rate is 1 inch per hour. And as a matter of fact, 1 inch per hour is a good draining soil for a rain garden. Now, what do we do if the site that we selected, and it's like the only site in our landscape that sort of fits the bill? Well, you can actually amend the soil underneath the drainage area to improve the infiltration through that soil. And we'll talk about how you can do that a little bit later on. The easier solution is to see if you can find another place in your landscape where you could place the rain garden that might have a little bit better drainage. Now, here are some places you definitely don't want to place your rain garden. You don't want to place it over any area of your septic system. That includes the drain field. You also don't want to put it on areas where water ponds after a rain event. This can be definitely indicative of poor drainage. It also may be indicative of a high water table. Again, you're not going to get the drainage you need out of your rain garden in those kinds of areas. You also don't want to place your rain garden on a very steeply sloped area, because what will happen is the water will roll into that depression with such force that it'll just scour it out and go on over, the rain garden and really not collect the water so that it can drain. So they recommend that a slope of from 2 to 10% is best. I don't know about you, but I don't know what a 2% slope looks like. So if you think of it this way, if you go out 10 feet and measure the height from whatever you're measuring with down to the ground, and there's like 2 feet difference, that's a 2% slope. So out 100 feet and it drops 2 feet, that's a 2% slope. You also don't want to place your rain garden inside the drip line of a tree, because digging that area can disturb the roots, which may be harmful to the tree. And probably more importantly is all of that water seeping down into the root zone of the tree may actually kill the tree if it's not one that can tolerate wet roots. And obviously, we don't want to be digging in an area that has underground utilities. So after you determine where your garden should be located, the next thing you need to figure out is how big do you have to make it? Because you want to make it big enough to handle the runoff from most rain events, but you don't want to oversize it. So you spend a lot of money and effort on a large garden that really isn't needed. So our overall goal in sizing our rain garden, and I'm going to apologize here, we're going to do a little bit of math, but nothing high-powered, you want the volume of the runoff that you're collecting to be equal to the volume of your rain garden. And just remember, volume is equal to area times depth. So to calculate the square footage that our rain garden needs to cover, the first thing we need to figure out is what is the square footage of the surfaces whose runoff will be draining into the rain garden. So, if you're collecting water from a downspout, you want to calculate the square footage of the roof that water is running off of. Same thing for driveways and sidewalks. Also, if you are collecting water that runs off of your lawn, you want to calculate the square footage of those areas. And remember, square feet is just length times width, not rocket science. So once you have the square footage of the areas that will be draining into your rain garden, the next thing you need to think about is how much of that water is actually going to make its way into the rain garden. And hydrologists have given us some numbers, they call them runoff values, that we can use to calculate how much of that runoff is actually going to make it to our rain gardens. For impervious surfaces like roofs and walkways, almost all of that water is going to make its way into the rain garden. And so the runoff value that you multiply your surface area by is 0.9. Now for lawns and gardens, a lot more of the water is going to soak into the ground before it reaches your rain garden. Actually, only about 25% of the runoff will reach the rain garden. So if you're calculating the square footage of a lawn area, you just multiply that by 0.25. So we have our area for our runoff. Now we need the depth to calculate the volume of water that will be running into our garden. It's recommended that for our area that we assume we get about 1 inch of rain per rain event. We're told that this covers most of our storms, and I don't know about you all, but I have a rain gauge and I go out and check it after, every time it rains. And unless we have a real gully washer like we had a couple weeks ago, that's usually a good number to use. And so we're going to use that number in our calculations. So those first 3 factors are going to give us the volume of water that our rain garden will be collecting. So now we have to turn our attention to the rain garden, and our unknown is the surface area of the rain garden. How much area does that rain garden need to collect? So we have one more assumption that we need to make in order to calculate that value, and that is how deep do we need to make that shallow ponding area that will be collecting the runoff? And for around here, for pretty good draining soil, whether it's native or we add amendments to make it better draining, 6 inches is a good ponding depth. Now, if you make your garden deeper than that, what's going to happen is it may not drain fast enough. And there are 2 ramifications of that. The first one is the water may sit around long enough for mosquitoes to hatch. And the second one is the plants that you placed in your rain garden may not be able to withstand sitting in water for that long. So try to target a 6-inch ponding depth. Now, if you make it shallower, it's not the end of the world. It's just not going to be as effective in some rain events. So now we can count, we've got all the unknowns that we can. So now we're ready to calculate the square footage of our rain garden. So our first step is take the square footage of all those impervious areas and multiply them by 0.9. You want to take the square footage of the permeable areas, like our lawns, and multiply them by 0.25. And this is our magic equation. To get the square footage of our rain garden, you take the numbers you got from step 1 and step 2, add them together, and divide them by 6. Okay, and that's based on our assumptions of 1 inch of rain per rain event and a 6-inch ponding depth. So let's look at a sort of a hypothetical example here. Let's say we want to build a rain garden that collects the runoff from this downspout right here. So the water is going to run off of this side of the roof into the gutter and come down through this downspout. And this is where we want to collect that runoff in a rain garden. So we got to first of all measure get the area of this roof. Now we don't want you climbing up on the roof with a ladder and a measuring tape. The easy way to do it is just measure from point A to point B. That'll give you one side of the roof. And let's say for this building, it's 30 feet. And then you want to measure from the corner of the building to the center, essentially the center of the building, or to where the peak of the roof is. And that gives you 10 feet. Now, if you can't sort of, figure out where the center of the peak is on the ground, just measure the whole distance and divide it by 2, either way. So the area of the roof is going to be equal to 300 square feet. All right, so we have the area of our roof. The next thing we need to do is figure out how much water is going to be running off that roof down this downspout to our rain garden area. So you want to take our 300 square feet and multiply it by that runoff factor, which is 0.9. The water's not running over any pervious surfaces, so we don't have any square foot for that. And so our square footage, we use our magic equation, and our square footage for our rain garden is going to be 45 square feet. Oops, let me leave it there for a minute. Okay, so this garden needs to be 45 square feet. Now there's different ways you can make that garden, shape that garden to cover that 45 square feet. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, a couple of other things when you're sizing the rain garden, they recommend that we keep our gardens under 300 square feet. And the reason for that is that it's a little bit difficult to make a level, shallow depression in an area bigger than 300 square feet. Now, if you're draining more than 300 square feet, it's recommended that you make 2 separate rain gardens to drain that area. All right, so we know where we want to put our rain garden. We know where it should be, where we want to put it in our landscape. Now it's really time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And this is probably the hardest part of putting in a rain garden. We're going to be talking in this section on situating the rain garden relative to the runoff flow. We'll talk about excavating the ponding area. And then we'll talk a bit about building the berm on the downhill side of the garden if your garden is in a sloped area. And the last thing we'll talk about is how to build a place for the water to enter the garden and then flow out of the garden when a rainfall exceeds the capacity of the garden. Now, fortunately, you don't need any fancy tools for building a rain garden. This is essentially what you need. Now, the only thing you may not have is a line level. And a line level is nothing more than a metal tube with a leveling bubble in the center and 2 hooks on the tube. And you put those hooks over a line, a string, and you stretch out the string, and you can move the ends of the string until the bubble in the center indicates that it's level. You might also need, if you're going to build a berm, you might need to borrow a soil tamper. Soil tamper is nothing more than a heavy piece of metal with a handle on it, and you use it to tamp down the soil. If you don't have one, no big deal. You can use a shovel, or you can just tromp on the soil really heavily. Rototiller is optional, but if you have what my father-in-law used to call tight soil, and it's a little bit difficult to get your shovel into the soil, you might want to rough it up with a rototiller in order to make it a little bit easier to dig, but you definitely don't have to have a rototiller. All right, so we know where we want to place our rain garden in the landscape. Now let's talk about how we situate the rain garden relative to the runoff. You want to maximize the spread of the runoff in your rain garden. You don't want it to all like pool in just one corner of the rain garden. So the first thing that you want to remember, and this is like stating the obvious, you want your garden to be downhill or downslope from the flow of the runoff. Water doesn't run uphill. The next thing is that we want to make our bed about twice as long as it is wide. And this will sort of maximize the spread out of the runoff in that bed. And the last thing is, excuse me, you want to make your long axis of your bed perpendicular to the flow of water. Again, this is going to maximize the capture and the spread of the runoff in your rain garden. Now, your rain garden can be any shape. There's no magic shape for a rain garden. Most people think that amoeba or kidney-shaped gardens are a little bit more attractive, but if you want to make a rectangular rain garden, that's just fine. The key thing in shaping your rain garden is that you want to make sure the square footage of the shape that you come up with is equal to the square footage that you calculated for the size of your rain garden. Now, if you have a funky shaped rain garden like I sort of have in this picture right here, to calculate its area, just break it down into rectangles and calculate, the area of the two rectangles and add them together and make sure they're equal to the square footage you calculated you needed. This is not rocket science, so if it's a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, it's really no big deal. Now, to lay out the shape of your rain garden, what you may want to do is use a hose or a piece of rope to lay out the general shape of the garden until you get it like you want it. Once you have the shape that you're satisfied with, you want to mark the perimeter because you're going to be digging along this perimeter. And you can mark the perimeter with landscape paint. I don't know about you, but I don't have a can of landscape paint down in the basement. Or you can use white lime, or I just use baking flour. For the temporary time that I need the shape to dig it out, it's just fine. Now, just a reminder, if there's any possibility that there are utility lines in the area where you'll be digging, call Miss Utility before you start digging. This is the 800 number to call to make sure, to have them come out and mark where the lines are so you're not digging into your electric line. Now, if your garden is in a relatively flat area, all that you need to do is start digging around that perimeter that you've marked. And you want to dig down 6 inches. So you want to remove 6 inches of soil from that whole area. The next thing, and this is a little bit hard, at least for me, is to ensure that the bottom of this area is level and that it's flat. And the best way to ensure that it's level is probably to use a carpenter's level. You could also use that string level and stretch it from surface to surface, make sure it's level, and then measure down and from that string and make sure, everywhere in that garden is 6 inches from that string. That's a little bit more work. So if you have access to a carpenter's level, that's better. Now, the other thing we need to do while we're digging out our garden is we need to ensure that clods of dirt from the sides don't fall into the garden, because after a while, that's going to reduce the depth of the garden. So they recommend that we slope the sides of the garden in to the bottom of the ponding area. And they recommend a 60 to 30 degree slope. I don't know about you, but 60 and 30 degree slope don't mean a lot to me. So I put a little graphic here to just help you sort of get a guesstimate of what that slope should look like. So here's the flat bottom of the ponding area. Here's the surrounding soil. And this is about what a 30% slope looks like. So you just taper the sides of the garden into the bottom. Now, most of us have properties that slope gently away from our houses, just to keep water from running into our basements or crawl spaces. And if you want to put your rain garden on a sloped area, then you have to do just a little bit more work. What you want to do is place a stake at the uphill side of your garden shape and another stake on the downhill side of your garden shape, and stretch a level string between those two stakes. That's where that line level really comes in handy. Then you want to start digging at the uphill side, and you dig all of this out until you have 6 inches from the line to the bottom of all of this area. Now, the soil that you dig out of here, you don't want to throw away. You want to keep it, because if we just dug this out, okay, so this is sort of the shape that we're going for. But if we just dug this out, there's nothing at the bottom here, bottom of the slope, to stop the water that comes into the rain garden. So what we have to do is we have to build a berm on the downhill side in order to get this level, flat bottom ponding area. And so what you do is you build a berm, and we're going to talk about how to build a berm in just a minute, so that you end up with your shallow, flat bottom, 6-inch deep ponding area with the soil on the uphill side holding the water in, and the berm on the downhill side holding the water in. Now, a berm is pretty important to a rain garden on a sloped area. And so we want to make sure that we build a really sturdy berm. Now, I'm probably stating the obvious here, but your berm is going to be tallest on the downhill side of your garden, and then it's going to gently slope up to the uphill side of the garden where the berm is not needed. Now, you want good contact of this berm with the ground that it's sitting on. So what you want to first do before you start building your berm is remove all the soil from the area, or all the vegetation from the area where you're going to be building your berm. And then you want to rough that soil up a little bit so you get good contact between the new soil that you'll be adding and the existing soil. The next thing you want to do is start building your berm, and let me go back to this slide. You don't want to pile up all the dirt and just tromp on the top of it to build the berm. You want to build it in layers. So you want to put down about 2 inches of soil, and you want to compact it. That's where that tamper that I was talking about can come in handy, or you can compact it with the back of a shovel, or just tromp on it really good. Then you add another 2 inches of soil and you compact it again. And you keep building that berm up gradually until it's at the appropriate height. So this is what your berm will look like eventually once you get it all compacted and built up. This is the soil tamper right here. You can sort of see that. You want to gently round the top of your berm so that it's sort of, aesthetically pleasing in your landscape. Now, how do we know when this berm is tall enough for this ponding area to hold 6 inches of water? Well, that's where our line level comes in to play. You want to stretch the line from the top side of the garden to the top of the berm, okay? And you want a level line. And then you want to measure from that line down to the bottom of your ponding area. If that's 6 inches, then your berm's tall enough. If it's only 4 inches, then you got to make your berm a little bit taller. So once you have your berm at the appropriate height, it looks good to you, the next thing, and this is a real important step, you want to keep that berm that you worked so hard to build from washing out in a rainstorm. And so it's real important that you get vegetation growing on that berm as soon as possible. So One of the things you can do is plant grass on the berm and cover it with burlap or a heavy layer of straw. If you can find it in the nurseries, you could cover the berm with sod. Usually in the summertime, sod's pretty hard to get a hold of. Or you can plant the berm with plants that are deeply rooted. A lot of our native grasses have really deep roots, and they would be a good thing to plant along that berm. You might want to put some mulch or burlap around those grasses to help hold the soil before they really settle in. Now, if the only place in your landscape to put your rain garden doesn't have good drainage, remember the little test we did? You're going to have to do some more digging. Our goal is to have our rain garden drain within 24 hours of the rain event. So if you don't have good drainage underneath your rain garden, that's not going to happen. And so what you're going to have to do is dig out an additional 10 to 12 inches of soil below your ponding area, your 6-inch depth for your ponding area. And you want to save that soil, because what we're going to do is amend that soil to improve its drainage. If you have clay soil, and I think most of us around here typically have clay soil, the sort of the recipe that you want to use to make the amended soil is shown here. It's 40% coarse sand, 20% topsoil, 20% compost, and 20% of that clay that you dug out from beneath your ponding area. Now, if you have sandy soil, here's the recipe for your sandy soil, but most of us don't have that problem. Mix all these amendments together and then put them back into that hole that you've dug below your ponding area, and fill that hole up to a depth of 6 inches from the top of the area that in which you're placing your garden. Now, this image was the only one I could find, and it shows using a backhoe to fill the area underneath the ponding area. You don't need a backhoe. You can just use a wheelbarrow and dump the soil into the garden. Now, you may be thinking, wow, that amendment stuff, that's a lot of work. I'm not sure I want to do that. Well, what happens if we don't do that? Well, water's not going to fill out of the garden fast enough. And one of the key concerns will be we turn that garden into a mosquito breeding area when it rains. Mosquito larvae will hatch if the water stands around for more than 96 hours. I think that's 4 days. Our goal is to have, sorry about that. Our goal is to have that water in our rain garden drain out within 24 hours. Now, the last thing we need to think about when we're putting in our rain garden is how we get the water in and out of the garden. Water can enter the rain garden one of two ways. What's called sheet flow, which is just where the water runs off of the land into your rain garden. And the other one is called concentrated flow, where the water comes like out of a downspout directly into your rain garden. Now, sheet flow is preferred because it's more gentle, but concentrated flow, we can deal with that as well. When we're constructing our inflow area, whether it's sheet flow or concentrated flow, we want to have the inflow area constructed so that, first of all, the water gradually enters into the rain garden. It doesn't come in like you're spraying it with a hose at full force. And we want that water to spread out throughout the rain garden. So what you want to do is sort of armor the inflow area with things like, rocks or flagstones or whatever, just to sort of slow the water down so it can spread out more effectively into our garden area. You might also want to put some larger rocks actually inside the rain garden where the water flows in, just to sort of help, again, slow the water down, keep it from scouring things out in the garden. Okay, so we've talked about how you can get water into the garden without scouring out our garden. Now we need to talk about what happens in those situations when our rainfall is so much that the runoff exceeds the capacity that our rain garden can hold. Well, to deal with that, there are two things that we can do. The key goal is to have that excess water gently leave the rain garden and not just run out in a real sharp stream. Just a word of caution here, as you're sort of thinking about where the runoff from your rain garden should go, you want to direct the overflow away from your house, but not onto your neighbor's property. So the first approach is to, if you have a berm, take a small area, maybe, a foot or so of the berm, and make it slightly lower than the rest of the berm. And then cover that area with something like larger pieces of gravel or rocks, so that as the rain garden fills up, the water is going to sort of flow over this area and out into the surrounding yard. You also want to make sure that the bottom edge of this area is covered with some pretty, what do I want to call them, strong plants. You don't want plants that are going to get washed away with this water as it flows out of the garden. So again, that's a good area for native grasses, for example. Now, the other option might be a little bit easier, and that is you just put a pipe at the top of your berm, and as the water fills in the ponding area, when it gets too full, it's going to run out the pipe, again, into the surrounding landscape. You might want to cover, again, the exit area of the pipe with rocks to keep from scouring out your surrounding lawn. In fact, you might want to cover this whole thing, get my mouse back here, cover this whole thing with rocks, just to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So we've gotten our garden built. Our next thing we're going to think about is planting plants in it. And as with any garden, if you want your plants to perform well, you want to provide them with the appropriate amendments. And so it's a good idea to take some of the soil from the bottom of your ponding area and do a soil test and see if that soil is missing any amendments. And if so, add them into the soil, work it up, level it out, and then you're ready to go ahead and plant your garden. Now, we've been talking about, installing a rain garden and all of that. Here's what a properly installed rain garden is going to look like after a rainstorm. It's going to look like, a puddle with plants growing in it. Properly constructed, 24 hours later, it's going to look like a regular garden. You wouldn't even know that those plants had been sitting in water 24 hours before. I believe that, yeah, this is a garden that was installed in Milwaukee. All right, now we're ready to do what I consider to be the fun part, planting our rain garden. The basic principles of planting a rain garden are pretty much the same as any other garden, but there are a few additional things that we need to keep in mind. And the first one is that the rain garden has areas of differing moisture. The lowest area of the garden, this is going to be the bottom of the ponding area. My mouse is not working. The bottom of the ponding area, which is called the lowest zone on this image. This is going to be the wettest part of the rain garden. This is where the water will stand the longest after a rain event. And so we have to have plants in that area that can tolerate having their feet wet for 24 or more hours. The area the next area is called the middle zone. And this is sort of up the sides of the ponding area. And plants in this area are going to be wet for a little while, but the water's going to drain out of that area fast because the ponding area is going down. And so plants in this zone are going to be those that can stand a little bit of water, little wet feet, but not for very long periods of time. And then the top edge of the rain garden is like any other garden in your landscape. So you can put any kind of plants in there that, you know, will thrive in that particular light condition. Now, selecting plants for a rain garden is pretty much the same as selecting plants for any other garden. We do recommend that you put native plants in your rain garden, and we'll talk about why that might be a good idea on the next slide. You want to have a pretty garden. So, you know, all the landscape principles that you've learned, choosing, you know, different species, different heights, different textures. You want your garden to be interesting throughout the year, so plants with different bloom times. All of that is important as you select your plants. Now, native plants are important to a rain garden, first of all, because those plants have adapted to our local wet, dry conditions. And so they can tolerate, you know, what goes on when it rains. Also, a lot of those plants are deep rooted. And so if the rain garden does dry out and stays dry for a long period of time, those deep roots can still be down in moist areas under the soil. And this is a good example. This, I don't know if you can see this, but this scale here is in feet. This is the depth of turf grass roots compared to the depth of some of our native plant roots. This little blue stem is a native plant in our area, and you can see that its roots go down, you know, 6 feet down into the soil. The other thing that using native plants in your garden, rain garden, helps with, and this is true for any garden, is they're going to attract pollinators, and they'll also provide habitat for wildlife. This picture here is from our rain garden in Reynolds, and you can see all the swallowtails on the Joe Pye weed in the rain garden. Now, once you've gotten your plants in the ground, it's important that you mulch your rain garden. And I mentioned earlier on that mulch is not just for aesthetics. It helps keep weeds down, certainly, and, you know, it helps keep some moisture around the plant roots, but it also is a place where microbial activity takes place that breaks down some of those organic contaminants in the rainwater or runoff, and it also keeps the surface of the ponding area slightly moist, so that when water does come into the rain garden, it can immediately start filtering out. Now, not any mulch will do for a rain garden. Think about it. You have a pond and it fills up with water. If you have a fluffy, lightweight mulch, what's going to happen? It's going to float to the top, and if you get too much rain, it's going to run over the sides into your yard. So you want something that will stay in the bottom of the rain garden when it rains. And so what's recommended is something like aged shredded hardwood mulch. Pine needles, for example, would not be a good mulch because they're just going to float away. And so you want about 2 to 4 inches of that mulch covering your ponding area. When you mulch a rain garden, it's just like any other garden. You want to use good mulching practices. Don't cover the crowns of the perennials, and don't put the mulch any closer than a couple of inches, or keep the mulch away a couple of inches from the trunks of trees and shrubs. Okay, we're going to wind up looking at some inspirations for rain gardens. I don't know about you, but when I start putting in a garden, I like to look at what other people have done to get some inspiration for my own garden. And so we're going to look at some designs, just a few, from an organization called the Low Impact Development Center, which is located in Beltsville, Maryland. And they're a nonprofit national research organization that focuses on sustainable stormwater management solutions. And here's their website, and you don't have to write that down. There's a handout that will go along with this talk, and it has all these web links already there in the handout. Now, rain gardens can be planted in the sun or in the shade. They can be a mix of perennials, shrubs, or trees. The key thing to successful planting in a rain garden is to make sure that you put the plant in the right place, okay? In the bottom ponding area, make sure you have a plant that can stand wet feet for a while, for example. So let's take a look at a couple designs. This first design is for a butterfly garden. It's a sun garden, and it's a 250 square foot garden. And it's planted primarily with perennials, and they're perennials that provide color throughout the growing season. These are some of the recommended plants that they have in that garden. Blue Star is probably the earliest of the blooming plants in that garden. And then the other three plants shown here bloom throughout the summer. They have one shrub in the garden. It's a possum haw, and it gets red berries on it, which will last until winter if the birds and the critters leave it alone. But it will give you color a little while into the winter. And of course, the New England aster will give you that lovely purple color in the fall. Now, the next garden is, it's a 200 square foot garden, and it's primarily for a partly shaded area. This garden is touted to be deer resistant, and you all probably know that deer resistance sort of depends on your deer. They don't know they're not supposed to eat certain things. But the plants that are in this particular garden are pretty unappetizing to deer. And again, they were chosen to give you sort of seasonal interest. Spice bush, for example, turns this lovely golden color in the fall. They recommend an Annabelle hydrangea, which is a period of these beautiful white white flower heads. Just a thing about hydrangeas. This Annabelle hydrangea is a smooth or an arborescens hydrangea, and deer really aren't attracted to it that much. If you put in those hydrangeas with the beautiful big blue flowers, those are called macrophylla hydrangeas, and the deer love those. So make sure if you're selecting a hydrangea for your rain garden, that you select one, either an arborescens or a paniculata hydrangea, are not as appetizing to deer. And then the last plan that we're going to look at is for a much larger garden. This is a 550 square foot garden, and it's planted with just trees and shrubs primarily. I think there's one bunch of perennials in here. So your rain garden doesn't have to have flowers in it. It can be just trees and shrubs. And again, they were selected to give you season-long interest. Here are some of the plants that are recommended in the garden. They recommend red osier dogwood. This does not get the pretty white flowers in the spring like our native dogwoods do. This plant is grown for its red stems in the wintertime. The stems turn a lovely shade of red, and they're really pretty, contrasting with snow, for example. The leucothoe and the clethra are both summer blooming plants, and they have wonderful fragrances. And then, of course, the serviceberry is a very early blooming tree. So lots of different ideas for planting your rain garden, and there's lots more on that website. There is on your handout list a reference from Penn State University that lists specific plants for the different zones of your rain garden. So you might want to take a look at that link to get ideas for other types of plants to put in your rain garden. Now, like all gardens, rain gardens also need some natives, or need some maintenance. Some things you want to keep an eye on are your plant maintenance. If you plant your rain garden with natives are pretty tough plants, but until they get established, they're going to need to be watered just like any other plant. Now, depending on, how tolerant you are for messy plants, you'll need to weed and remove dead debris periodically from your rain garden. And because of the unique water conditions, unique water conditions in the garden after a storm, you want to monitor your plants and make sure that they're doing all right in the zone in which you place them. You may find that you may need to move a plant from, the ponding area of the rain garden up a little bit higher to the side of the rain garden because it really can't stand those really wet conditions. You also want to keep an eye on your berm if you have to build a berm on the bottom side of your garden. Sorry about that. I guess it's telling me it's 11 o'clock and it's just running through the stuff. Sorry about that. Okay, you need to keep an eye on your berm because if it fails, your garden's going to fail. It's not going to hold the water and let it gradually run out of the ponding area. So after a rain event, check your berm. Make sure that it's not eroding away. If it does have some failure, you want to fix that failure right away, okay? Don't leave it because it's just going to get worse. Like with any other garden, you also want to do a soil test periodically on the soil in the ponding area of your rain garden. Remember, this thing's going to fill up with water and drain out, fill up with water and drain out during the rain events. And so it could be washing away, the nutrients that the plants need, or it could be, messing with the pH in your rain garden. So do a soil test every couple of years of the soil in your ponding area. You also want to keep an eye on the mulch. Remember, the mulch has some pretty important functions in a rain garden, and you want to keep that, replenishing that mulch, every year or so to keep that 2 to 4 inch layer covering the ponding area. Now, if you find that after rain events, your ponding area is not draining as well as it used to, you want to take a look at it and see what's going on. You may find that you have sediment building up on top of the mulch layer. And if that's the case, just, take that mulch off, that top layer of mulch off, and get that sediment out of the garden. Or you may need to take, like a pitchfork and open up holes in the bottom of the ponding area, just to let a little bit more, to increase the drainage capacity of that area. So we've built our rain garden, we've planted it, and now Mother Nature can bring on the rain. And you can give yourself a pat on the back because not only have you put in a beautiful garden, but you've done something good for our waterways. I kept referring to references that you might want to take a look at that are in the handout that goes along with this session. And I want to point out just a couple of them quickly. Reference number 3 here comes from the University of Connecticut, and it will get you to a lot of short YouTube videos on the different phases of constructing a rain garden. It's very informative. Reference number 5 down here is that reference from Penn State that I was talking about that told you about different plants that can go in the different zones of the rain garden. And of course, the link number 7 down here is to that organization in Maryland that had all of the rain garden templates. Now, closing out today, I want to remind you of something else. If you've been listening to this session and you think, ooh, that's a lot of work. I see why a rain garden is good, but I'm not sure I want to put all that effort in. Well, the Virginia Department, let me get the name right, of Soil and Water Conservation, I'm sorry, the Virginia Soil and Water Conservation Districts, I'll get the name right, have a program called Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. And this is the website to that program. And this program will help with design and installation of a rain garden. And if you qualify, they'll reimburse you for some of your expenses of putting in a rain garden. Now, I don't know anybody, I don't know a whole lot about this program, and I don't know anybody who's actually taken advantage of it, but it sounds like a really good program if you need help in putting in a rain garden. Okay, so any questions on anything that we've gone over?
We don't have any questions. I just want to say that I think this is an amazingly great presentation, and the references are amazing. And I really had no idea that so much went into a rain garden in order to make it function properly. So thank you so much.
Yes, Linda, thank you so much for your informative presentation and for educating us on creating a rain garden. We really appreciate your time and effort. And as Linda mentioned, she's put together a great handout. You can get to it through the library's website by going to the registration page. And if you want to view her presentation again, or you know someone that may be interested that couldn't make it today, let them know that it will be accessible through the library's website. From our homepage, you can click on the adults icon, or you can click on the link to our YouTube channel. And don't forget, the library has great resources for gardeners in its branches and through its digital library. So if there are no further questions, I just want to let you know that you can join us again on Saturday, September 10th at 10 a.m. in person at the Goochland Library, when Linda will be back with us to talk about harvesting herbs. So are there any other questions from our participants? Okay, well, Linda and Audrey, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today, and see you on September 10th.
Thanks, everyone.